Welcome to the Cherry Hills Church podcast. We're in a teaching series called Origin Story, studying the book of Genesis as the foundation of the whole story of the gospel. Thanks for joining us as we learn who God has always been and who we are as part of his story.
A reading from Genesis chapter 7. The Lord then said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, a male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him.
Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and of all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark, as God had commanded Noah. And after the 7 days the floodwaters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks.
Have a seat. The floodgates of the heavens were opened. Well, good morning at church. My name's Luke. I'm the spiritual formation minister here. And we are continuing in our series through the book of Genesis. And today, what we've just heard is the beginning of the story of the great flood. The story runs all the way from parts of chapter 6 up through chapter 8, and then the beginning of chapter 9 as well. So I'm not going to today walk us verse by verse, commenting on the text as we go, as you might usually do. Instead, what I'm hoping to do is kind of take a closer look at the story by actually zooming out a little bit and looking at the big picture here. You ever had the experience where you've seen something 1,000 times and then somebody points out some feature of that thing to you and you're like, I've literally never seen that before. Like, has that been there the whole time, right? This can happen in a number of ways. Let me give you a quick example. You can throw the U-Haul logo up in here. You ever notice, this may be new to you, maybe not be, the little horizontal H in the U-Haul is supposed to look like a trailer hitch. So it's hauling something. Yeah, it's clever, right? Props to the marketing team at U-Haul. This is one of those things, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And here's why I make this point. Here's the thing about familiarity. Sometimes familiarity breeds blindness. I know that the flood story, Noah's Ark and the animals 2 by 2, right? I know that it is one of the most famous, or rather infamous, depending who you talk to, stories in the Bible, both inside and outside the church. But it is not for that reason the better understood. So what I'd like us to do is to take a closer look at the story. And when we do, I think it raises all sorts of interesting and hard questions. Scientific questions and ethical questions in particular. And those are really important things. And in a moment, I'll briefly address some of those. But here's what I want us to know, if you're following in your notes. What's more important than the questions the story raises is the questions the story is answering. Okay, so a good reader of any kind of literature doesn't come to the story demanding answers from the story. Right? Demanding answers to the reader's questions. On the contrary, a good reader comes to the story seeking to understand what question the story was written to answer. Like, we're the guests, right? And we can't go demanding things of the author. We have to have a hospitable approach to the literature to see what does the author want us to say. Why was this written? This story wasn't passed down to us just to satisfy curiosity about the past. It's part of a grand narrative that we call the gospel. And in its biblical and theological context, it was written as an answer to a significant question. So, we'll talk about most of our time today. What is that significant question? Why does this story exist? Why was it written down? Why is it part of our Bible? But just to address some of the elephants in the room, to get on the table, the questions that the story raises for us as modern readers. Let me just say a couple things about this. And again, these aren't the most important things, but when there are difficulties, things that challenge us in the Bible, I think the church has a responsibility to make those discussable. So I want to honor that, all right? An ancient reader of this text would have had very few scientific scruples with the story and the way that it's told. They didn't have archaeologists and geologists and biologists raising questions. We do, right? Many scientists today suggest that the Earth is much older than 6,000 to 10,000 years. If you visit a natural history museum, maybe you've been to one of these, right? You see some dinosaur bones. The paleontologists are going to say that humans and dinosaurs didn't coexist. A lot of geologists today claim there was never a global flood, or never a catastrophe like the flood globally. And there's numerous other questions that are debated among Christians. There's Christians on all sides of all these questions and topics, right? We debate the elements of the flood story and what the scientific record shows happened and how to read the story in Genesis. Now, I recognize some of you have never given that much thought, and you're blissfully unaware of all of that. And you're like, I just read the story, sounds good, I moved on to the next chapter. What's the issue? Others of you, you've really wrestled like painfully with questions of science and faith, and it's been a stumbling block in your spiritual journey. It's caused doubts. You're trying to investigate it. It really bothers you in some way. So if this is something that you want to think through more, I can tell you myself, Brian, Steve, others on our staff would be happy to talk more in depth with you about those things because they're good and important questions. But here's what we really want to get across, right? Don't take the present conclusions of much of modern science and create a wedge out of it, right? Science is important. Biblical interpretation is important. And a healthy intellectual character matters a great deal to your formation and your witness. It does. But science is not going to be the wedge that splits God's church apart, right? So we're not going to make a particular interpretation of the flood story the litmus test for genuine faith and sound doctrine. Now, the flood account also raises ethical questions. Many Christians today, we kind of trivialize the flood story. When I was just a little tyke, I went to Noah's Ark Christian preschool. And when the parents were dropping off their kids, I have to imagine they didn't think of it as divine judgment Christian preschool, right? All of the imagery is cute little animals just marching 2 by 2 onto the boat ride with the rainbow at the end, you know? And I recognize that for little kids, we have to be sensitive to the details and the nature of the story. I don't suggest we traumatize our 4-year-olds down the hall when we tell the story. But as we grow up, as we mature in faith, we need to reckon with some of the challenging bits here. You know, it's easy to tell the story when you don't count the bodies. But there are some hard things about this. How do we wrestle with God engaged in violence in the Bible? It's a real question. It's an honest question, isn't it? And here's the thing I would tell you, right? God blesses Jacob. This is a story later in the book of Genesis. God blesses Jacob when he wrestles with him all through the night. And sometimes when we wrestle with God on some of these questions that we have, that actually produces more spiritual life. That actually produces more vitality, more flourishing, more blessing through that and on the other side of that. There is a kind of constructive conflict in the Christian journey that God invites us into. Read the Psalms. There's a back and forth engagement we can have with God about these things. So these are some of the challenges that the text presents to us as modern interpreters. Some of you feel the force of those questions more than others, but as important as those questions may be, they don't get us closer to the heart of the story. Why is this here in our Bibles? So the story is answering a significant question. If you're following your notes, here's what I think it's all about. The flood story addresses the question, what is to be done about sin? What's to be done? See, the flood story was written down and included in our Bible to teach us about God's response to the degradation of creation on account of human sin. And in many ways, the whole Bible is about that. Once you get past chapter 3, the whole rest of the story is what is God going to do about sin? And so the flood story is one kind of prefiguring, foreshadowing, one clue as to who God is and what he's going to do to address the sin problem. If we then can understand why God floods the world, we can better understand the gospel itself. I think there's basically two coexisting reasons why God floods the world: judgment and renewal. And in the gospel story at large, as in the flood in particular, judgment and renewal are kind of two sides of the same coin, as I hope we'll see. So Genesis has been telling up to this point a series of fall stories. First, there's the fall, Genesis 3, Adam and Eve in the garden, they take the fruit, tricked by the serpent. And then there's fallout, there's consequences, right? Nature is corrupted and death and all of this. They rebel against God, they cross the boundary of their humanity, seeking to be like God themselves. They're expelled from the garden and the land is cursed. And then Cain murders his brother Abel. Again, the land becomes inhospitable to him. His brother's blood cries out from the ground. And the cycles of violence after chapter 3 and 4 get exponentially worse. We can tell through the genealogy, culminating in Lamech, who boasts of his violence. He's proud of it. He's taunting God about it. And then just before the flood story in Genesis 6, we get one of these other false stories, which is a strange story. Brian talked about this a couple of weeks ago about boundary-crossing spiritual beings who spawn a race of violent warriors. Crazy stuff. It's bananas, right? But this is the subsequent fall, again and again, cosmic spiral of death. If you're following in your notes, humanity didn't just fall, it's falling. It's like bouncing down the stairs here. You know, we had the first trip and then it's just head over heels again and again and again and again. That's the progress of the narrative of Genesis leading up to the flood. Each successive moment in the opening chapters paints a picture of the undoing of God's creational intent, his original goodness in creation. Humans are caught in this vicious cycle, this spiral. And so as readers of Genesis, going faithfully through chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and on and on and on, we ought to be wondering, what is God going to do about this? Who's going to break the fall? What is going to be done to address the problem that's begetting more problems over and over and over again? What is going to be done about sin? This cannot go on forever, right? It's a question of consequences. See, Adam and Eve, they're given consequences when they sin. But those consequences aren't apparently or immediately terminal. In other words, they go on living, and human sin goes on and continues generation after generation after them. There might be some downsides and some consequences, but they can still go on living. And this is the complaint of so many of the authors of Scripture. If you're in the Psalms and if you're in the prophets, they're always complaining, God, why does it seem like the wicked are getting away with it? What are you going to do about this? All the bad people are flourishing and all the good people are not. This seems totally upside down of how it ought to be. Something needs to be done to address the sin problem and the violence and the evil that exists in the world so that the wicked don't prosper. Because right now it seems like they do. It seems like the unrighteous can escape ultimate consequences. They might have some temporary or consequences here and there, but there's no ultimate consequence to evil. God doesn't seem to notice what's going on as we're spiraling out of control here. They're upset about this. And they're raising questions. Well, is sin really that bad then? Maybe nothing will come of it in the end. Perhaps in your own life, you've gotten into a rhythm, a habit where you probably haven't consciously thought, sin's not that bad, God doesn't notice, I can get away with this forever. But maybe there are things in your life, inclinations and patterns you've developed over time, small ones, big ones, minorly destructive ones, really destructive ones, obvious and visible ones, and secret and hidden ones, where we get into a place where we live functionally as if God doesn't notice, God doesn't care, there are no repercussions, I can sin with impunity. That's a dangerous place to be. The flood is a warning against that way of thinking, to call us out of a life like that. I've been reading recently the novel Dorian Gray. by Oscar Wilde. It's one of his famous pieces of writing. And Dorian Gray, he remains forever young and handsome and charming, and he's got the golden ticket in life, right? And things go so well for him, but he's got this self-portrait tucked away in his house, locked away in a secret room. And the self-portrait reflects the genuine state of his character, of his inner life. He goes on decade after decade without aging, but the portrait ages. It gets old and the wrinkles come, and he gets the look of decay from evil inside his heart reflected on the face of the painting. And this is the point, right? Eventually, what's inside catches up to us. We cannot escape forever the things that we've done. We might for a time be able to forego some consequences, but no matter what outward appearances or the present conditions of our life may indicate, eventually we are undone by the sin that catches up to us. The flood stands as a warning for this as well, right? It is not for nothing that Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it is often the case that when sin catches up to us, there's collateral damage. You can see this in the flood story. There's fallout just beyond humans themselves, right? Sin is not just a problem for human beings. It's a problem for all of creation. It's a problem for the earth, the land itself. Genesis chapter 6, 11 through 13 says this. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Let me make an observation here, I think is crucial, right? The way verse 13 is translated makes it seem like God is going to ruin creation. God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people. Like God's going to be the bad guy who just, for no reason, he comes in and he burns the house down to the ground. But in verse 13, Hebrew literally reads this way, the end of all flesh has come before me. It's not a declaration of intent, it's an observation. Here's why I think this matters, right? God's determination to destroy the world is not like a conqueror who comes in to burn cities to the ground. It's more like a home inspector who realizes that there's termite rot, termite infestation in the house. And so he marks it condemned to be destroyed so you can build again from a new and fresh foundation. Right? The judgment of God here is not sentencing the world to die so much as pronouncing the world already dead and pursuing the subsequent consequences. If you're following in your notes, God doesn't ruin the world, violence does. That is a huge, huge distinction to make in the story because it runs against the grain of the other myths in the ancient world from Babylon, Assyria, and these other places about angry gods and vicious deities, right? It's important that we get that so we maintain something about the goodness of the character of God here. Now, I recognize also it's strange for us to think about the earth itself being corrupted. What would that even mean? How is the land inhospitable? This doesn't make a lot of sense to the modern individualist mind. Good news, though, the Bible was not written by modern individualist minds. And there is something that ancient writers understand better than we do. That is the intimate connection between human beings and the environment itself, even at a spiritual level. This is actually baked into the very name of humanity in the book of Genesis. The first man is named what? Adam, right? Adam or Adam, right? Adam is just the form of the Hebrew word for ground or earth or land or soil, Adamah. Adam is from the Adamah. So if you're a New Yorker, you're from New York, right? He's called Adam because he's from Adamah. He's a groundling from the ground, an earthling from earth, right? We are part of creation. What we do affects creation. Our fates are bound together, intertwined. That's something that the ancient world understood so much better than we do. This is why Paul, he'll also say this in Romans chapter 8. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. See, the story of the gospel is not only personal, it's also cosmic in scale. It's a rescue mission for all of creation that God loves. All of it. The very logic of atonement in the Bible, the reconciling of humans and God, the very logic of atonement is that sin pollutes both the sinner and the environment. You read Leviticus, you'll get this. Sin is corrosive and it's contagious. It's not only people, but sacred space that gets defiled by sin. If you're following in your notes, the whole of creation is being ruined by the people that God put in charge to care for creation. There's a big problem here, right? That God needs to address. The gardeners are planting weeds. So now the whole thing has got to go. That's why God judges the earth through flood. But if you're following in your notes, the flood is not only an act of judgment, it's also a path to renewal. There is something on the other side of this great death. According to the law of Moses, when something is corrupted, when it's polluted, when it's contaminated, it becomes morally or ritually unclean, it needs to be washed. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to go through a purification ritual or ceremony. And the two most potent detergents in the law of Moses are water and blood. When something or someone needs to be purified, water and or blood is usually involved. And through those means, sin is buried or covered over so that new life can emerge. Purity can emerge. New creation can emerge. So if you get that, you can make sense of what seems like a rather strange passage in 1 Peter. See, in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter is writing about Noah's Ark. He's reflecting on the story. And he says that the inhabitants of Noah's Ark, quote, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism, which now saves you also. And you read that and you're like, wait, does he know the story? The water is the bad thing. What do you mean you're saved through water? Why would Peter say that water in Noah's flood was salvific? And what does Peter think that the flood and baptism, why does he think they have something in common? Because these are both acts of divine renewal. They are. They're both acts of divine renewal. I don't know if you've ever thought about your baptism this way, but it is a picture of Noah's flood. It is. When you were baptized, you were immersed in death to make way for new life. Jesus also speaks of his own death as his baptism. In Luke chapter 12, verse 50, this account is also in Mark. Jesus says, I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Now, notice at this point in Luke's gospel in Luke 12, Jesus has already been baptized by John on the Jordan River. So they're like, well, he's been baptized already. What is he talking about? He is talking about the cross. He's talking about that moment of his death as his baptism. And recall, by the way, what's said to pour from Jesus' body at the moment of his death. Water and blood. Because these are the two ingredients for cleansing and renewal. So look, I'm not trying to downplay the judgment here. I'm just trying to help us see that God's judgment in the flood is part of a larger work of renewal that God is doing in creation. So the caricature of God in the flood story is that God is an angry, violent deity who just flies off the handle and goes postal, wipes everybody out. You know, he's just up to here with it. He can't tolerate anymore. He's reached his limit. He's surpassed it. And so he just goes into a rage. And everyone dies and everyone suffers and everybody indiscriminately is in the warpath. I watched a stand-up comedy bit by Ricky Gervais. He did this several years ago. And in his comedy bit, he goes on stage and he opens up this little children's book. It's the story of Noah. He was given this children's book when he was in Sunday school as a little boy. It's got his little name signed in it, you know. And he goes on through the comedy routine and essentially makes fun, mocks the viciousness of God. Like everybody thinks this is such a sweet children's story. And he talks about God like this bloodthirsty, vicious savage. And it lands, it connects, right? The whole room, everybody's laughing, right? Because this is the portrait of God that exists in many people's minds today. But in actuality, that has far more in common with the Babylonian flood story than anything the author of Genesis is trying to say. In the Babylonian flood story, it's known as Atrahasis. It's a flood narrative that probably predates the writing of Genesis. The gods send a destructive flood because they're annoyed at noisy humans disrupting their sleep. The flood is basically population control for the ancient world. That's the portrait of the God who floods the world that exists among Israel's neighbors. How different is the God of the Bible? How different is the God of Genesis? I don't know if you imagine this ever, but could you maybe picture God's face when he's observing the world filled with violence and when he's sending the flood? If you did that, if you try to picture, what would the look on his face be? Is it like the veins in his neck bulging? Is his cheeks, are they red? Is his eyebrows furrowed or his teeth gritted? Is he just ticked? If that's the way that you picture it, that's not the Genesis story you're reading there. You might be bringing that in from something else, but that's not the way that Genesis tells the story. In fact, in the whole flood account, every bit of it from Genesis 6 through Genesis 9, in fact, in the entirety of the book of Genesis, God is never said to be angry. It's never an emotion ascribed to God in the book of Genesis. He's described that way in other parts of the Bible. But in the book of Genesis, in the flood story, he's never described as angry. There's only one emotion that's ever reported of God in the Genesis flood account. You know what it is? It's grief. It's grief. Genesis 6:6 says that God's heart was deeply troubled by the evil in the hearts of man. That phrase, deeply troubled, is sometimes translated sorrow or grief. It can also be literally translated as physical harm, to be hurt, to be injured. It's the pain that comes from love. Right? If you've ever loved and lost, you know exactly what God is feeling here. He's grieved by how the earth and the righteous have suffered on account of sin, and so he's going to do what's necessary, bringing judgment against evil in order to give his world renewal. It's like the house with termites, right? The deconstruction isn't punitive, it's restorative. If you're following in your notes, in the flood, new creation. Chuck said this so well in the beginning. New creation involves decreation. Decreation. Now, why would we say that the flood is a decreation event? To make sense of this, you got to go back into Genesis chapter 1. The creation begins from chaos waters, these kind of primordial swirling waters at the depths of the sea. In the beginning, the earth is formless and void, darkness and deep. So what's God do? Well, he doesn't get rid of the darkness, he bounds it with light. And he doesn't get rid of the watery depths, he separates, he creates boundaries, the waters above and the waters below. Notice then that in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, which we read this morning, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. They're collapsing in on one another. The flood is the waters above and the waters below smacking down together, returning creation to the way that it was before the Spirit of God hovered over the waters and God spoke, "Let there be light," and "let there be," and "let there be," and "let there be." That's what the flood story is narrating, God giving over his creation to the forces of death, formless and void, wild and waste once again. But he's not doing that without restorative purpose. There's an Old Testament scholar named Matthew Lynch who's been really helpful for me in a number of places studying, preaching this text. He offers this great analogy to explain God's decreative act in the flood. He says this: God acts as a potter who sits at the spinning wheel and discovers that his clay pot is full of air bubbles and thinning walls. The wet pot has begun to collapse under its thin walls, and the clay is thoroughly corrupted by air bubbles. In fact, as he looks, he sees its sides peel away and start flapping around as the pot spins on the wheel. It is useless, utterly ruined by violence. So what does the potter do? He stops the wheel and takes the clay into his hands. He forms a new ball of clay out of the old. He returns the clay back to a state of useful formlessness. The potter returns the clay to this preformed state in order to remake it. How does God remake it? The Spirit of God shows up, just like he showed up in Genesis chapter 1. If you're following in your notes, the Spirit of God takes the waters of death and disorder and brings order and new life. Genesis 8, verse 1 puts it this way. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. That word wind is ruach. It's the same word for spirit that's used in Genesis 1 when God hovers over the waters. This pattern in Genesis 1 and Genesis 8 shows up one other time in the books of Moses. In Exodus chapter 14, Israel is on the run from Egypt, and they are caught at the Red Sea, the waters of death about to consume them. They've got nowhere to go until Exodus 14:21. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Right? The ruach of God, the wind, the Spirit, orders the waters of chaos and turns death into life, bringing forth dry land out of the depths of the sea. Anybody hearing some echoes of Genesis in that? I mean, the Spirit of God is at work in so much the same way because God works in these types of patterns to reveal himself. So why does God flood the world? Because God judges sin to free us and all creation from its power. And the flood whispers this to us, and the cross shouts it. It's a clue to us in Genesis. Helen Painter says it this way. God appears for a time to lose the battle with the forces that oppose him, but out of the carnage emerges a man, the one blameless man, into a new created world, to be the progenitor, the father of a new humanity. See, both the flood and the cross are acts of renewal through judgment. But the difference is that in the days of Noah, the righteous lived and the sinful died, and yet in Christ at the cross, the righteous died that the sinful might live. The outpouring of judgment is ingested by Jesus. Jesus drinks the cup. Jesus undergoes the baptism. And the depths of the earth swallow the crucified one. And the Spirit of God raises him up and us with him into life in the new world. That is the picture of the gospel that we can glimpse and foretaste in the flood and realize in glory in the cross. That is our arc right there.
Thank you for listening to this week's teaching. If you'd like more info on our church, you can visit our website or find us on Facebook.